Hi, this is Gary Gensler, and welcome back to Office Hours. What does the SEC have to do with crypto? And why is the chair of the SEC talking about crypto? Now, technology has come along decade after decade, but those that have a chance to thrive, grow, come within a public policy framework. To be clear, I think that the SEC should be technology neutral. But one thing we're not neutral on is investor protection. Our agency, the SEC, has had rules for decades to protect people when companies want to raise money from them, or when we as investors buy and sell securities on an exchange like the New York Stock Exchange. But you see, crypto trading platforms, crypto lending platforms don't have the same level of investor protection that you've come to expect buying and selling stocks on a stock exchange or investing in a mutual fund or a 401k. In the years since Bitcoin was started, literally thousands of other tokens have been launched, many of which traded on platforms may well be securities under our laws. That means if the platforms and certain of the tokens don't register with the SEC, they're non-compliant with the important federal protections in our laws. So I've asked staff of the SEC to use all of our authorities anywhere we can to uncover any wrongdoing. Our authorities aren't enough. I've also recommended to Congress for them to consider filling those gaps with a goal of investor protection. To those currently or considering investing in crypto, please remember, not only are they a highly speculative asset class, but there are also significant gaps in the investor protection afforded to you. I think that moving forward, promoting investor protection is not only good for you and for anyone who would consider investing in these assets. I think that it's the only real viable path forward for this nascent technology. See, at the heart of finance is trust, and trust rests on investor protection. And so that's what the SEC has to do with crypto, investor protection.
Now, big tech is now so big that it's a risk to the global financial system. That's a warning from the Bank of International Settlements. It says the vast amount of data held by the likes of Google, Facebook, Alibaba and others means these companies could easily and rapidly reshape finance, and that could have a destabilizing effect on existing banking systems. The BIS says it wants to see regulators rein in big tech fast. And joining us now is the General Manager of the Bank of International Settlements, Augustin Carstens. Sir, fantastic to have you on the show. This was a fascinating new report. I read the entire thing yesterday. Can you start by explaining this specific fear, how we go from these big tech giants with access to huge volumes of data to potentially seeing entire banking systems destabilized? What's the key?
Well, thank you very much for having me in your program, Julia. I think the key issue is what we call it the DNA of big techs here in the BIS. DNA is data, networks, and additional activity. The thing is that by the use of data in a network environment, that can multiply the number of transactions that is being done through a particular payment service, and that will produce more information and it will produce more advantage. The real issue is that today commercial banks do not have equitable access to all the information that big techs have. And well, of course, big information is a key input into financial services. And therefore, if you have a larger or broader command of information, you will have a comparative advantage. So this has a lot to do also with who has the control of the information of people. So what we are trying to steer is a debate on how information should be used, who should have command of it, and in that way, I would say, enhance competitiveness in the future in the financial services industry.
I mean, you use a specific example, and that's China, where we know two big tech companies, Alibaba with Alipay and, of course, WeChat with WeChat Pay, account for 94% of the payments market, and they scaled up incredibly quickly. Now, it's a completely different market to some extent than others like the EU and the United States, but do you see that specific number there is a reason perhaps why the central bank's looking at digital payments, looking at a digital coin, a central bank digital coin of its own, because that amount of power in the hands of private companies is frightening for any nation, China or anywhere else?
Well, I would say that there are two big instruments that central banks and financial authorities have, but in particular central banks. That's regulation, and the other thing is to provide central bank digital currencies. I think that it's very hard to imagine a world today with all these cyber currencies, cyber assets, and I would say the appetite of the public to have digital solutions for transactions and not have central bank digital currencies. At the end of the day, I think that reality will impose itself. And what we're seeing today is a lot of drive by central banks to move forward with CBDC. Each country will take their own decisions, but this is a very important area. And the other is regulation. Yes, what you just said at the outset in this question is the tremendously fast progress that big techs with financial services as financial services provider can give. And I would say the unequal treatment from the point of view of regulation is what puts commercial banks in a disadvantage. So what we are really trying to put on the table is the need to have equal treatment between different providers of financial services.
So if we take an example of the United States, I mean, you've got Google, you've got Facebook, you've got Amazon, for example. Only really Apple Pay, as an example for Apple, is one that's really pushed into the payment space in some sort of fundamental way. Are you saying that regulators need to look at the activity level, look at the scale of data, and sort of formulate regulation for entry for these tech companies, for example, before they try and go into the payment space in a more fundamental way? Because once they do it, they can scale up so quickly, it then becomes really hard to tackle.
Well, the issue of regulation is very complex. Entry certainly is one. In a way, for example, today, to have a bank, you need to have capital, you have to obey different rules on liquidity, leverage, and so on. That is something that at some point, given the different types of services that big tech, financial services that big tech might offer, it might be adequate to move in that direction. The other important aspect, as I say, is the use of data. Today, banks have some very specific regulation on how they can use data, right, and that is not necessarily the case with big tech. And finally, there is another important issue, and that is that many of these big techs provide some services that have become key in the financial sector industry. For example, cloud services. So you have competitors also being important services providers for financial systems. So therefore, I think that there is a lot of things that we need to think and to basically have a system with three characteristics: that is competitive, that is safe, and that is respects privacy of people.
Yeah, and the classic example of this is Amazon with their access into e-commerce. The next step to payments and facilitating those e-commerce purchases would be very easy for them. The question is, to your point, is there a level playing field with what the banks can provide? And right now there isn't. There's a trust issue here as well. A lot of people don't trust big tech, but they don't trust governments, quite frankly, either. And that's part of why we've seen, I think, the interest in cryptocurrencies. And I saw back in January, you said, look, there's real risks here and that Bitcoin, for example, could go to zero. How do you feel about this today? And how do we separate all of these issues and make sure we get all of them right? The regulation in each sector, because there are those that say the most efficient way of using and facilitating payments in the future in the financial system is crypto. Where does the BIS stand on this?
Well, where we stand here is that we need to certainly take advantage of all the technology that is out there. For example, the technology on which Bitcoin is based, DLT and blockchain is a wonderful technology, and I think we need to adopt it. Now, the real issue is the application. I think that Bitcoin, in the way it was formed, is not really delivering what it's supposed to deliver, which is a good substitute for cash. It's not a good deposit of value. It's not a good medium of exchange. It's hugely volatile. It's an ecological disaster. So what we want to do is to use the technology and offer people a better representation of really trusted money. What is the really trusted money that is out there? Well, it's basically cash. And today, cash is just represented in papers and coins, and people are asking for digital solutions, and therefore we have to raise to the challenge and provide them with cash in the digital form. That also would facilitate many financial transactions. It would facilitate, for example, to reduce transaction costs in cross-border payments. It would facilitate also financial inclusion. We have still even in countries like the US, a high percentage of the population still doesn't have access to financial services.
Right.
And therefore, it would be interesting to look for something like this to make a dent in that regard.
Every time I think about the payment space and the future of payments, my head explodes because there's so many things to consider. And this was a whole new one, this report, and I loved reading it. So come back and talk to us soon, please. Great to have you with us. Agustin Carstens, the General Manager of the Bank of International Settlements. Great to talk to you, sir.